Hello and welcome everyone to how to easily get nutrients you need on a raw food diet. We are super excited to share with you some important facts about two of the nutrients most commonly asked of us, iron and vitamin B12. For those of you who don't know us yet, I'm Dr. Karen Dina.
And I'm Dr. Rick Dina.
We are known as the developers and instructors of the Science of Raw Food Nutrition series of classes we taught for 10 years at Living Light in Northern California, and for making complex scientific concepts easily understandable to a general audience. We are also the hosts of the Raw for Life Summit and authors of the Raw Food Nutrition Handbook.
Now, before continuing on, I do need to make it clear that the information and opinions expressed in this webinar are not intended to be used as medical advice and should not be used to diagnose or treat any medical condition or as a substitute for individual health care. This webinar is presented with the understanding that we are not liable for misconception, misuse, or adverse effects resulting from the use of the information that we share. Any type of dietary change, nutritional therapy, or fasting should always be undertaken with the supervision of a qualified healthcare practitioner. And we may be those practitioners for you in an individual consultation, but it's not going to happen as a result of this webinar, which is for educational purposes only. Having said that, let's continue on. In our webinar today, we'll address some of the common misunderstandings about raw food nutrition, in addition to iron and vitamin B12. When Dr. Karen and I got started with raw food 26 and 29 years ago, respectively, there were far fewer resources than there are today. Due to the internet, access to information about raw food nutrition is easier than ever before. But is the internet really the best place to find accurate, useful information on raw food that will sustain your maximum health for a lifetime? We've heard over and over again from our students and our patients that the internet is a great place to go if you want to get confused. People on YouTube and social media often use raw food as a platform for drawing attention to themselves and to create controversy. They know that creating controversy increases engagement and views, which gets them the attention they're seeking, but what does it do for your health? The point is, it's harder than ever to find accurate, reliable information on raw food diets. It seems so ironic that in this time when information about raw food nutrition is more easily accessible than ever before, that the percentage of that information that is of reliable and accurate quality has never been lower. It's what I call the information age paradox, and it's likely to continue and only get worse from here. For example, we see headlines for programs where you can make a living in the alternative health field doing what you love. Now, incredibly, one of the selling points for this program is that you don't need to know anything about health in the first place. Don't worry about it. You don't know anything about health. You can still make a living in the alternative health field online. What they suggest you do is you look stuff up on the internet and then you give your followers your spin on it. Let them follow you, be vulnerable, that's the new credibility, and have them follow your path. Now, the thing is, that's more of a soap opera than a way to get accurate information about raw food nutrition. So you have newbies checking stuff out, putting their spin on it, and the same information keeps going round and round, and people are left more confused than ever. It's what I call the take and wake model. They take, and you're left in a wake of confusion, wanting to be healthy, but not really knowing how to best go about it. Well, this is what makes us and our approach stand out from the rest. In our work, we break through the confusion, and we show you how you can do that too. When I started out almost 30 years ago, so many of these same confusing issues were as much of a source of debate back then as they are today. Except everything seems so amplified now due to the internet. We have spent so much time sifting through and weaving information from these different points of view into a workable whole that's made a huge difference in our health and for so many others that we've worked with over the years, for thousands of other people. Occasionally, some truly new information does come along, and as we're committed to being lifetime learners and we love what we do and this stuff gets us excited, we study it and we learn about it. The nice thing in our situation, though, is we've got this solid foundation to put the new information into perspective that oftentimes even the advocates of the new information don't have. Even the best information isn't useful if it can't be applied properly. So the foundation of the core issues are still there, just like they were when we got started. And having a solid foundation which allows you to know how to navigate all the seemingly confusing information coming at you today in today's choppy waters is priceless. Consider this quote from a past student of ours about just how valuable this can be. Denise from Alberta, Canada says, "There isn't a better course available designed to arm anyone desiring to improve the health of themselves and others, allowing them to weed through news reports, marketing, and research. Add on top of that a balanced, open approach, presented in an inspiring yet modest manner." We know how tough it can be when you're first getting started. We were there too, and had to make sense of all the opposing viewpoints such as high fruit versus low fruit, food combining protein, calcium, B12, and all that stuff, and we were committed to figuring it out.
I, for example, found raw food at a time when I was experiencing notable fatigue, for which there was apparently no answer. I was in college at the time, and I was sleeping 10, 12, and sometimes even more hours per night, and still waking up non-refreshed. I felt probably a lot like this woman in the picture looks like. I saw 3 medical professionals, and after multiple lab tests and evaluations, I finally had a diagnosis: fatigue of unknown origin. They had a whole list of everything that I didn't have, but could not pinpoint the source of my fatigue. I asked every single one of them if my fatigue may have anything to do with my college diet and lifestyle. They all emphatically said no. Things started to change, however, when a friend gave me a copy of a book that discussed vegan diets and the connection between diet and health. I also learned about the connections between diet and the environment and the way that animals are treated. Now, with all of these compelling arguments, I was open to giving this approach a try, and I became vegan. In addition to feeling good about eating compassionately and leaving a lighter footprint on the earth, I was so excited to find that my fatigue finally started to improve, despite what the so-called experts, in this case the medical professionals, said would happen. This personal experience opened the door to my thinking that diet really could make a difference in my health, and left me open to exploring other opportunities. When I learned about and implemented a raw food diet, my energy soared far beyond the impressive improvements I experienced by eating a vegan diet. I felt like jumping for joy, just like this woman in the picture here. I just felt so good. Now, in our 3-part video series, I shared the story of my introduction to raw food. Long story short, my fatigue vanished, along with a variety of other symptoms that I'd had for years, and I had more energy than I knew what to do with. I could not remember a time when I felt better. I started to look healthier. I slept better. I enjoyed exercising, and my digestion improved. I was so inspired by the health results that I was experiencing that I felt compelled to learn more about the inner workings of the human body and nutrition and the diet and health connection. I really wanted to immerse myself in learning as much as I could. So I earned a second undergraduate degree in biology and received doctorate-level education in naturopathic medicine and chiropractic, which helped me put everything that I observed into perspective and on a much deeper level. Now, over the years, I've refined and revised my approach to raw food and tailored it to my individual needs, and we can show you how to do this too. So this brings us to the topics of our webinar. Let's talk about iron and vitamin B12. One thing I want to show you here is that the amount of information we're going to talk about today represents this tiny little blue slit. So as you can see, we're going to cover some good information here today, but it's really just the tip of the iceberg. Our first topic of discussion is iron. Now, iron is an element. And here it is. on the periodic table of the elements. And hopefully this doesn't conjure up fear in you from high school chemistry or college chemistry. I remember the first time that I saw the periodic table of the elements, I was thinking, oh my gosh, I had to actually memorize it. But you know what was really interesting is that my high school chemistry teacher really made the periodic table of the elements come alive, because he mentioned that all of the important minerals that we need are found here on the periodic table. And there's iron right there circled in red. Now, iron is a really important mineral. And one of the most important things that it does is it's involved in the formation of red blood cells. And the role that it plays in red blood cells is carrying oxygen from the lungs to the tissues. And it's also involved in carrying carbon dioxide away from the tissues to the lungs where it can be exhaled. Now, sometimes when people are low in iron or they have iron deficiency, then their body's ability to oxygenate the cells might be a little compromised. And so sometimes these people experience fatigue. Now, when I was experiencing fatigue in college, an iron test was one of the things that I was given. As it turned out, I wasn't iron deficient, so my doctors looked on to other things. Now, some other things that iron is very important for is it's involved in energy production and immune system function, among other things. Now, the recommended dietary allowances are listed up here, and they are good, reliable numbers. So 8 milligrams for men and postmenopausal women, and then for premenopausal or menstruating women, or women of childbearing years, that's 18 milligrams. Those women need more iron than postmenopausal women or men. And then for pregnant women, we need more. So I always encourage people to check with their healthcare provider if they're pregnant to see what their iron levels are. Now, there's two main dietary sources of iron. There's the heme form and the non-heme form. Now, the heme form is found in animal foods and supplements. And when I say animal foods, I'm mostly referring to red meat. Now, many different supplements that I've seen have the heme form of iron, and how I can tell is by looking on the bottle, and if I see the words ferrous sulfate, that means that's the heme form of iron in that supplement. Now, the non-heme form of iron is the type of iron that's found in plant foods. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard this, but I've heard many times people say things like, oh, isn't the iron that you find in animal foods more absorbable than the type of iron that you find in plant foods? And my answer to that is this. It's a little bit more specific than that. As it turns out, the form of iron that's found in plant foods is more selectively absorbed than the form of iron found in animal foods. And what that means is that with the non-heme form of iron, the iron status of the person affects absorption. So this form of iron is absorbed more readily when it's needed by the body and less readily when it's not needed, which is actually really good because iron is a really important mineral, but we don't want too much of it. Now, with the heme form of iron, that form is what's called less selectively absorbed. And what that means is that that form of iron is absorbed whether or not the body needs it. Having enough iron is important, but too much can potentially be problematic. And the reason why is because iron can act like a free radical. And a free radical is a molecule that can cause damage to body tissues in addition to other health problems. And excess iron intake may be associated with a variety of different health challenges. Now, iron toxicity is one that I hear about that's usually associated with people, specifically kids, for example, consuming too many iron supplements. Like they get into the medicine cabinet and they get into the supplements. And oftentimes, that may be the result. So we have to be careful with that. Now, colorectal cancer, or colon or rectal cancer, has some association with iron intake in excess amounts from dietary sources. There's some great studies done on that. There's also lots of studies that have shown that excess iron intake from dietary sources might be associated with increased risk for heart disease because iron acts like a free radical and can potentially cause damage in the form of oxidation to the plaque that lines our arteries. Alzheimer's disease, there's been some interesting studies done on that, although the studies are still kind of new. So we don't really have full information on that just yet. And then there's other health challenges as well that might be associated with excess iron intake from dietary sources. Now, there are some substances that we find in certain foods that can bind to iron and keep that iron from being absorbable. Now, not all foods contain these substances. For example, oxalic acid, also known as oxalate or oxalate, binds to iron in food and keeps that iron from being fully absorbed. Now, oxalates are found especially in foods like spinach, rhubarb, Swiss chard, beet greens, and parsley. These foods are considered to be high in oxalic acid. And what that means is that the iron that's found in these foods is less usable by the human body, because oxalic acid binds so tightly to that iron and doesn't allow it to be fully absorbed by the body. Now, these are not bad foods. They're just not a great source of iron, especially when they're raw. A couple things I want to mention about oxalates is that they don't steal iron from other foods. So, for example, if you make a smoothie with spinach and kale, for example, the oxalate in the spinach will not steal iron from the kale. And in addition to that, oxalate will not steal iron from your body. Okay, so that's good to know. Now, I mentioned earlier that not all foods contain oxalic acid. Now, let's take a look at some leafy greens and some other sources here that are good sources of iron. So lower oxalate greens would include things like kale, dandelion greens, broccoli, romaine lettuce, and bok choy. For example, if we look at kale here, we've got 3 cups chopped. That has 3.42 milligrams of iron. That's excellent. If we compare that to the daily value, 3 cups of chopped kale compared to the daily value for a premenopausal woman of 18 milligrams, that's excellent. Now, if you're somebody who really likes dandelion greens, they can be a great source of iron too. And we have here that dandelion greens, 2 cups chopped, have 3.41 milligrams of iron. That's excellent. Now, it's interesting to look at the iron content of individual foods. But let's take a look at the amount of iron that we find in foods when they're eaten together. So we have an example here of a medium-sized salad that has 4 cups of romaine lettuce, 2 cups of dandelion greens, 1 cup of cucumbers, 1 cup of carrots that are grated, and 1 cup of chopped tomatoes. And then for a dressing, we have a simple lemon tahini type of dressing, 1 tablespoon of tahini with 1 tablespoon of fresh squeezed lemon juice. We have 9.3 milligrams of iron. That's excellent. Just in that salad alone, we have reached the daily value for a man and a postmenopausal woman for iron content. And here's a picture of the salad and the salad with the dressing right next to it. It's a medium-sized salad. So once again, the recommended dietary allowances for iron, 8 milligrams for men and postmenopausal women, and 18 milligrams for premenopausal women.
So when you take these things that Dr. Karen just got finished talking about, as well as some other considerations, and you put them all together, how do you actually know if you are getting and absorbing enough iron and it's doing in your body what it needs to? Well, there are a few simple blood tests to look at that will tell you what your iron status is. The first one is called a CBC, or complete blood count. In the UK and Australia, and I think some other countries, they call it an FBC, or a full blood count. Now, I don't have the opportunity to go into all of that. For example, at the 2014 Woodstock Fruit Festival, I gave an hour-long presentation just on the complete blood count, and then there were questions afterwards, so it was just an hour, and I could have extended that as well. So a couple of small pieces, but important pieces of the complete blood count we'll look at here is, number one, we're going to take a look at something called hemoglobin. Dr. Karen mentioned that iron was an important component of hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is the part of red blood cells that transports oxygen from the lungs to the tissues and then picks up a carbon dioxide in those tissues to bring it back out to the lungs so we can breathe it out. An iron atom is at the center of every hemoglobin molecule. So if you are low in iron, your body will not be able to manufacture as much hemoglobin as it should. So you will see then that your hemoglobin count is low. And when hemoglobin's low, usually along with something called hematocrit, that qualifies you as having anemia. And when you're anemic, that means you can't bring enough oxygen to all of your cells. So you don't feel so good, you're tired, your brain doesn't work so well because your brain isn't getting the oxygen it needs. Wounds don't heal very well because your body needs oxygen for so many important things. That's why they tested Dr. Karen for iron when she was fatigued back in her late teen college years. There's other reasons as well that somebody may become anemic. The way to determine if low iron is leading to the anemia is by looking at the size of the red blood cells. If you look at the inside volume of a red blood cell and take the water away, the great majority of that volume is hemoglobin. There are tens of thousands of hemoglobins stuffed into every red blood cell. So when there's plenty of hemoglobin stuffed in every red blood cell, the red blood cells are normal sizes. When hemoglobin is low, because iron's low, then the size of the red blood cell gets smaller, kind of like a water balloon that you let some water out of. It's smaller now. So when you see hemoglobin low and red blood cell size being low, that is a very solid indicator that your iron stores are low and you need to make some changes. And once you do, you're going to feel a lot better because you'll be getting more oxygen to all of your cells, including your brain. Another way of measuring your iron stores is by looking at something called ferritin. Ferritin is the storage form of iron. Now, this is one of those examples where things can look a little bit different if you're on a plant-based diet. Remember, Dr. Karen talked about the difference between heme and non-heme iron. And she said the heme iron found in animal foods gets absorbed whether your body needs it or not. So in other words, you can absorb some excess. And there are a number of issues that Dr. Karen mentioned that go along with that. If you're absorbing more iron than you need, your ferritin levels will be artificially elevated. Because most people tested in the world are omnivores, that becomes the quote normal range. So it's not uncommon, in fact it's typical in vegans, that ferritin is within the reference range, but it's down there near the lower end of the reference range. That doesn't mean you're low in iron. That simply means you have enough and you're less likely to get some of the issues that the people with excess iron have. Sometimes I've even seen ferritin levels in vegans slightly below the reference range. You don't want to go too low. That's not good either, but sometimes slightly below the reference range. And when I see that, and I also see hemoglobin, hematocrit, red blood cell count, red blood cell size all normal, I'm not too worried. So in any case, the bottom line is, when analyzed appropriately, and I can't emphasize how important that part is, when analyzed appropriately, some very simple blood tests can tell you if your iron status is good and you should keep doing what you're doing, or if there is some need for improvement.
Our next section is vitamin B12, the ever-fascinating topic. Now, vitamin B12 has a scientific name, cobalamin. And the reason why it's given that name is because if we look at the center of the vitamin B12 molecule here, we see a cobalt atom. So that's where the name came from cobalt. Now, vitamin B12 is essential. It's needed for a variety of different functions in the body, and the body needs to get it from an outside source. Now, here are some of the important vitamin B12 functions. Number one, vitamin B12 is involved in the formation of every single cell in the human body. And the reason why is because it's involved in genetic code replication. Our genetic code, good example, is DNA. Another type is RNA. Now, when we have a cell, a new cell forming from another cell, for example, the DNA from the original cell has to be perfectly replicated and transferred into the daughter cell, or the cell that is forming the new cell. And so vitamin B12 plays an extremely important role in the replication of that DNA. Another thing that vitamin B12 is important for is the maintenance of nerve cells, specifically the myelin sheath on the outside of these nerve cells, or neurons. Now, what myelin sheaths do, or what myelin does, is it helps with the propagation of the nervous system signal through that neuron. Now, if that myelin is interrupted, such as in a vitamin B12 deficiency, then that nervous system signal cannot properly propagate through that neuron, and then you end up with what's called neurologic symptoms that we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. Vitamin B12 is also important for the production of serotonin. And serotonin is a brain biochemical, also known as a neurotransmitter, that's involved in creating the moods of happiness. B12 also decreases a substance called homocysteine. And homocysteine is very inflammatory. It's related to heart disease, and vitamin B12 breaks it down. So it's very important for that function. In fact, homocysteine is a vitamin B12 test, as we'll talk about shortly. One thing I like to mention about vitamin B12 deficiency to my students is it's best not to wait until these symptoms show up, because sometimes when these symptoms show up, what that means is that you have a long-standing vitamin B12 deficiency. People who have vitamin B12 deficiency often have what's called large cell anemia, or megaloblastic anemia, also called macrocytic anemia. And people who have that oftentimes may experience fatigue. Now, when I was experiencing fatigue back in college, this was one of the tests that one of my doctors gave me. And as it turns out, my vitamin B12 status was fine. Now, some of the other symptoms that people can experience with vitamin B12 deficiency are also listed on this slide. For example, numbness and tingling and a burning sensation in the fingers and toes, hands and feet. That's called peripheral neuropathy. Now, if that numbness and tingling and burning sensation gets worse, and if it starts to move inward, sometimes you can end up with tremors and poor coordination. Now, that's a very long-standing vitamin B12 deficiency. There's lots of other symptoms that can come up as well, and I encourage people that if they have any of the symptoms that we have listed up here on the board, it's a good idea to get tested for vitamin B12. But I do like to mention that these symptoms, a lot of them are not specific to vitamin B12. There are other health challenges where you might find these symptoms as well. In a vitamin B12 deficiency, you might have decreased serotonin, which may lead to depression in some people, and elevated homocysteine. When homocysteine levels are elevated, that might be contributory to cardiovascular disease, and homocysteine in and of itself is inflammatory. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, vitamin B12 breaks down homocysteine. Now, I like to mention that vitamin B12 deficiency is not just an issue for vegans and vegetarians. And my classic example is the Framingham Offspring Study. Now, this study was published in the year 2000, so this information is not new. It's been around for quite some time. It's very well understood. Now, in this study, there were almost 3,000 people, and 39% of them were either in the low normal range or deficient in vitamin B12. And what's really fascinating is that these study participants were not vegetarian, vegan, or raw foodists. They were all omnivores. They were all eating animal foods. Now, this surprises people sometimes because oftentimes animal foods are thought to be a good or reliable source of vitamin B12. But this study shows us otherwise. It could be that the vitamin B12 just isn't in the animal foods, or it's not being absorbed. But really the bottom line here is that B12 is not just an issue for vegans and vegetarian and raw foodists. It's an issue for everybody. And in fact, I tend to be more concerned about omnivores with B12 than vegans, because vegans tend to be very well educated about vitamin B12 issues. So this is something that I think everybody should be aware of. Now, how much vitamin B12 do we need? As it turns out, we don't really need all that much. For adults here, 2.4 to 2.8 micrograms per day. That's micrograms. Now, how much vitamin B12 do we find in supplements? What I've seen is anywhere from 500 to 1,000 micrograms in a dedicated vitamin B12 supplement. There's other amounts that I've seen as well, but those are the standard measurements that I see. So 500 to 1,000 micrograms per capsule tends to be the most popular denominations that I tend to see. People oftentimes ask, because there's so much vitamin B12 in these supplements, can you potentially get toxic on B12 from taking them? And the answer is, I've never seen that happening. And probably one of the reasons why is because vitamin B12 is what's called a water-soluble B vitamin. It's a water-soluble vitamin. And what that means is that if the body doesn't need it, it just gets rid of it. Now, vitamin B12 taken in excess of the body's needs can be stored in the liver. And so the body does do that. But then when the liver stores are full, then the body will just get rid of the excess B12 beyond that. So there's no worries that I'm aware of getting potentially too much vitamin B12. Now, why is it that supplement companies tend to put so much vitamin B12 into their supplements? Well, maybe one of the reasons why is because some people may have trouble absorbing. In which case, if they put a large dose into the supplement, then if that person takes it and they have trouble absorbing, there's a good chance that they're at least going to get some B12 in, or that they're going to at least be able to absorb some of that vitamin B12. Now, how much vitamin B12 do I take per week? I take 1,000 micrograms 2 times per week as my maintenance amount, and that works very well for me. I like to encourage people to get tested for vitamin B12 to see where their levels are and to see if their supplement or whatever food they're eating is working well for them or not. Now, people oftentimes ask me about food sources of vitamin B12. And some of the big ones we have listed up here, for example, fermented foods. Can fermented foods have vitamin B12 in them? And the answer is yes, they can. But the challenge is not all fermented foods have vitamin B12. In order to have vitamin B12 in these fermented foods, what you need to have is the bacteria that produce that B12. Because vitamin B12 is made by bacteria. A lot of this bacteria lives in soil and lives in the environment, and if some bacteria that makes B12 gets into some fermentation product, then potentially that fermented food can have B12 in it. But I wouldn't count on it. Most of the studies that I've seen about fermented foods show that they are not a reliable source of vitamin B12. And the same is true for sea vegetables. In fact, there was several studies that were published years ago that talked about the vitamin B12 content of a variety of different sea vegetables. One of them was nori. There's also been some more contemporary studies done on nori. And what's been found is that nori seaweed, when it's freshly harvested and when it is wet, has human bioactive vitamin B12 in it, at least in the samples that were studied in this one particular study that I saw. But what was found was that once that seaweed was dried, then unfortunately that vitamin B12 was no longer human bioactive. It became what is called a vitamin B12 analog. It looks like vitamin B12, but it doesn't act like it in the human body. And unfortunately, getting that seaweed wet again doesn't reactivate the vitamin B12. It still stays a vitamin B12 analog. So I think this is where some of the confusion is when it comes to sea vegetables and vitamin B12. Because a lot of people have said, oh, but I've seen studies that show that sea vegetables are a great source of vitamin B12. Well, they are potentially, not always, potentially when they are freshly harvested. But once they have been dried, the vitamin B12 in them tends to be what's called a B12 analog. Once again, it looks like B12 but doesn't act like it. Now, what about the vitamin B12 that lives in our intestines? Well, let's take a closer look. If we look up here on the screen, vitamin B12 producing bacteria lives in the large intestine, which is this green structure that I'm pointing to right here. So that's where vitamin B12 producing bacteria lives. Unfortunately, vitamin B12 is absorbed in the last part of the small intestine. And here's the last part of the small intestine right down here. That's called the distal ileum. So, unfortunately, the vitamin B12 that is made in the large intestine doesn't travel backwards to the small intestine. So, unfortunately, we can't utilize that vitamin B12 made by bacteria in the large intestine. Vitamin B12 is not absorbed in the large intestine. It's absorbed in the small intestine, the last part of the small intestine called the distal ileum. As you can see here on our picture, things move one way in the digestive tract, from the small intestine into the large intestine, and not backwards. Now, I'm oftentimes asked about vitamin B12 sources, specifically supplements. And one of the most reliable sources of vitamin B12 is supplementation. Now, for somebody who is really vitamin B12 deficient, their doctor may refer them for an injection because they might need to get some into their body right away. But for most people, supplementation is pretty reliable. Now, there's many different forms of vitamin B12 that are available in supplemental form. And here's a sampling. We have methylcobalamin, cyanocobalamin, and hydroxycobalamin. Now, hydroxycobalamin is the form of vitamin B12 that is made by bacteria in nature. So if somebody eats a food that has B12 produced in nature in it, specifically hydroxycobalamin, then what happens is the body takes that hydroxycobalamin, takes the hydroxy group off of it, and then sticks a methyl group on it, and that activates it. Because the human active form of vitamin B12 is methylcobalamin. It's one of the human bioactive forms. Now, cyanocobalamin is one of the most common supplemental forms. It's got a long shelf life, so supplement manufacturers like to make it because it'll sit on a shelf for years and still work. Now, methylcobalamin, at least the form that I get and that I use, is good for about 2 to 3 years, but some cyanocobalamin manufacturers claim that their cyanocobalamin can stay fresher longer and still work. Now, if you take a cyanocobalamin supplement, what your body will do is it will take the cyano group off of it and it'll stick a methyl group on there, thereby activating it. So all forms, all 3 of these forms of vitamin B12 from supplements can be converted into human bioactive forms, with the exception of methylcobalamin because that's already human bioactive in the form that you get from the supplements. Now, what form do I use? I've been using methylcobalamin for years, and I have really good results. Now, one thing I like to mention to people is one of the best ways to know if your vitamin B12 supplement is working is to get a vitamin B12 test.
And as far as lab testing to determine your vitamin B12 status, there are several ways to go about that. One of which is testing vitamin B12 itself, but you can see I've got a few other strategies up here on the slide as well. And each one of those strategies has its pluses and minuses and can come in handy depending on the situation that we are presented with. So let's start out with the CBC, or complete blood count, also known as the full blood count. We looked at that in the iron section, and we said that that can help determine if somebody is anemic and if that anemia is due to iron deficiency. It can also determine if somebody is anemic due to vitamin B12 deficiency. So if the various measurements on the complete blood count panel, such as hemoglobin and hematocrit, are low, the way to determine if low B12 is leading to that anemia is by, as we did with iron, looking at the size of the red blood cells. Now with iron, we mentioned if there wasn't enough iron, the size of the red blood cells would be small. In the case of B12, if B12 is low and that's leading to anemia, in that case the size of the red blood cells is large, and that's how you know it's B12, not iron being low, causing the anemia. For those of you who like a little more technical detail, there's two major reasons why the red blood cell size is larger when you have vitamin B12 deficiency. Number one, Dr. Karen mentioned how B12 is involved with activating folate, and folate is involved in cell division. When immature red blood cells turn into mature red blood cells, a number of different cell divisions have to occur. Immature red blood cells are larger than mature ones. So if there's not enough B12 to activate folate to create enough cell divisions to end up with mature red blood cells, you end up with the immature red blood cells out in your bloodstream because that's the closest thing the body has, and they are larger. Number two, we mentioned that the red blood cell size gets smaller when there's an iron deficiency anemia, and that's because iron makes hemoglobin, and if there's not enough hemoglobin, red blood cells aren't as packed full of hemoglobin, so they get smaller. Well, if you have B12 deficiency and you don't have as many red blood cells as you need, but there's still the normal amount of hemoglobin, what will happen then is your body will try to stuff more hemoglobin into each red blood cell, and that will make the red blood cell size increase because you're stuffing more hemoglobin in there. Now, because folate's involved, and folate's usually high in raw vegans, you don't always see this red blood cell size situation occur if a raw vegan has a vitamin B12 deficiency. Although just recently I did see someone not anemic on their CBC, but the red blood cell size was getting big. So that can be an early indicator of B12 deficiency, and in their case we tested their B12 also, and that was significantly low. So as this person improves their vitamin B12 status, we're going to expect the red blood cell size to decrease. Before we get to B12 itself, let's take a look at a couple of the other fancier tests over here on the right. First one being homocysteine. Now, Dr. Karen mentioned that vitamin B12 is involved in the breakdown of homocysteine. Homocysteine is an amino acid that at high levels can cause inflammation and irritation of the blood vessel walls. And when blood vessels are inflamed, they're more likely to have oxidized fats and cholesterol and inorganic minerals and dead cellular debris and all sorts of stuff accumulate and build up the lining of the artery walls and make it and create plaque, which can lead to heart attacks and strokes and other issues. So in any case, if B12 is low, that can increase homocysteine. If vitamin B6 is low, that can also increase homocysteine. Or if folic acid or folate are low, that once again can also increase homocysteine. So if any one of these three nutrients are low, homocysteine is going to be elevated. So if you're looking at your blood chemistry results and your homocysteine's elevated, you don't know which one of these nutrients you're low in. Although in my case, because in my practice I see mostly raw vegans, folate comes from foliage. Okay, fruits and vegetables contain folate, so I've never seen low folate in a raw vegan. Fruits and vegetables are good sources of most of the B vitamins, all basically except B12, so it's pretty unlikely vitamin B6 is low. But nevertheless, you're not absolutely certain B12 is low if homocysteine is elevated. Now, on the other hand, because any one of these nutrients being low can cause homocysteine to be elevated, if your homocysteine is low, then you know that all three of these nutrients you're in good status for them. Now, there's a few other things that can affect homocysteine as well, but those are the big three. So in other words, if your homocysteine is appropriately low, you know that folate, B6, and B12 are good. So let's say I'm measuring someone who's concerned about cardiovascular disease. Maybe some things in their lipid profile look a bit off. Maybe they have a history of heart disease. Maybe they've had a heart attack or a stroke. One of the things I might order to fully assess their cardiovascular profile is I might order homocysteine, because the CBC won't tell you if homocysteine's elevated and potentially causing inflammation in blood vessels. Vitamin B12 itself won't tell you that, or methylmalonic acid will not tell you that. So as part of a cardiovascular panel, if someone also wants to get their vitamin B12 status checked, I may choose homocysteine in that situation as the most appropriate way to go. And if homocysteine's low, their B12 status is good. If it's elevated, then we'll have to go a little bit further to figure out why it's elevated. So it's a clinical decision based on many other factors that need to be considered. You can also test something called methylmalonic acid. You can test that in the blood, where it's called serum MMA short for methylmalonic acid, or in the urine, where it's known as UMMA. Now, if somebody is starting to get low in vitamin B12, methylmalonic acid will be elevated. And unlike homocysteine, vitamin B12 being low is the only thing that will increase methylmalonic acid. So if methylmalonic acid is elevated, either in the blood or in the urine, you know for sure B12 is low. Now, if methylmalonic acid is low, like with homocysteine, you know that your vitamin B12 status is good. So that is good to know. Now, I have had several patients who were not in good vitamin B12 status. And I did a variety of measurements here: the complete blood count, vitamin B12 itself, homocysteine, and methylmalonic acid, and I've looked at them all together. What I found is pretty clear. Once somebody starts to consume a reliable source of vitamin B12, methylmalonic acid will decrease. In other words, it will respond more quickly than homocysteine will decrease, more quickly than you start to see changes on the complete blood count, and more quickly than you will see the vitamin B12 level directly start to be elevated. So if you're starting to get low on vitamin B12, or if you are starting to improve your vitamin B12 status, methylmalonic acid is the most sensitive indicator, going in either direction. So it's very useful in that regard, and I utilize it in my practice. You can also measure vitamin B12 directly. Now, the advocates of the urinary methylmalonic acid test, which again, I am not against that test. I utilize it when appropriate because it can tell you a lot. The advocates of that will say that the serum B12 test is useless because if you are consuming large quantities of sea vegetables, and those sea vegetables contain B12 analogs, like Dr. Karen just mentioned, if you dry the sea vegetables, the human active B12 can turn into B12 analogs. What you can see then is that your serum B12 level may look good, but the test is measuring these B12 analogs that won't actually work as B12. So therefore, something like homocysteine or methylmalonic acid, or looking at the complete blood count potentially, will actually be more useful. On my YouTube channel, I made a video called Methylmalonic Acid, Chlorella, Spirulina, different things, my personal experience, where I talk about a situation where I had good B12 status from taking spirulina in my case, but it didn't actually improve my vitamin B12 status based on the other tests. Some of the advantages, though, of testing B12 directly is that if people are not consuming significant quantities of sea vegetables, then you don't need to concern yourself with this the majority of the time, in which case it's a very useful test. Now, when I'm talking to patients about what to get tested and what to check for and what you don't need, the B12 test is much less expensive than homocysteine or urinary or serum methylmalonic acid. So you can save $150 or so, and as long as you have a clinician that knows what they're looking at, which you would in my case if somebody's working with me, you can save that $150 and you can do something like test your thyroid function. So it's very useful in that regard. Now, what if you are taking vitamin B12 and you're consuming more than you really need? Well, whether you have enough B12 or whether you have excess amounts of B12, methylmalonic acid, homocysteine, and the complete blood count will not make that distinction for you. Those tests can't tell whether you have just enough B12 or if you're consuming too much. Whereas when you test B12 directly, you can see if you're consuming too much. Now, that's not necessarily a problem because vitamin B12 is water soluble and it's not going to cause any negative health effects. What it can do, though, for you is let you know, look, you're consuming more than you need, and you can cut back on your B12 supplement and save yourself some money. So I'm happy when I can help utilize people's resources, including their financial resources, most effectively. So there are times when vitamin B12 itself is more appropriate than the other tests, despite what you may have heard out there on the internet with people just repeating rhetoric who are not themselves very well educated and responsible clinicians. So going back to our summary slide, the complete blood count can tell you some things about your vitamin B12 status, sometimes but not always, and Dr. Karen made a video on her YouTube channel about how high levels of folate can mask vitamin B12 deficiency in raw vegans. So there's the complete blood count, but that's not always the case. So sometimes this can be a useful indicator to see what's going on. B12 itself can be very useful, more useful than homocysteine and methylmalonic acid in some circumstances, and homocysteine and methylmalonic acid each have their attributes as well. Now that you've heard a little bit from us about iron and vitamin B12, you've got a little bit of a taste of how we teach and how we utilize some of this information clinically. Just a little bit of a tiny taste here. If knowing information like this to help you succeed with raw food and plant-based diets to experience a higher level of health is important to you, then we have a solution. If raw food science explained to you in easy-to-understand terms in a fun format with plenty of time for that information to sink in, as well as using a manageable time commitment and plenty of opportunity to ask questions and get clarification directly from us is important to you, then we invite you to join us for our Mastering Raw Food Nutrition and Educator course. This course is going to start in early September of 2016, and it's a 12-month course. The time commitment is about 2 to 3 hours per week, and what that consists of, it consists of about 2 hours worth of content. And that content comes in the form of professional quality videos, similar to what you saw here on this webinar. You'll also get an audio version of each of the videos that you can listen to in your car or while you're making dinner or home, or just listen to it a few times if you'd like to let it sink in more. You'll also get a comprehensive set of notes that we will send to you. And those notes include everything that you'll see in the videos, including any graphics. Now, in addition to that, we're offering every week a 1-hour live question and answer session where you interact with us directly in real time. Sometimes there'll be one of us there, so if Dr. Karen teaches a section, then she'll be there for the question and answer. If I teach a section, then I'll be there for that question and answer. But sometimes you'll also hear from both of us. Now, we want you to be as healthy as possible and experience all of the joy and benefits of eating and living this way has brought to our lives, and that's why we're offering you this weekly support. We've listened and know that is what people want, and having that opportunity can make all of the difference. So we've got, on the one hand, you can watch the basic content at your own schedule, but on the other hand, you'll meet with us every week, because that provides structure and that allows you to get your questions answered and to keep on track and to let things sink in even more. So I've got listed here workout partner and accountability partner. I remember back when I was in chiropractic college, I had a good friend who I worked out with each morning. And there were so many mornings when I would show up and I would say, oh man, if I didn't have to come pick you up, I would have skipped going to the gym today. And you know what he said? If I knew you weren't coming to pick me up, he would have skipped going to the gym that day as well. So neither of us would have worked out on our own, but we did because the other person was coming and we didn't want to let each other down. Now, at the same point, if you miss a week, don't worry about that because you can always access the content from the previous weeks. But we would encourage all of you to attend those weekly calls because they're so helpful and you get your question answered directly. Here's a quote from one of our previous students. The real strength of this course is the willingness of both presenters to engage students and respond to questions. Keep it up. In other words, we like answering questions and we like going over this stuff with you and interacting with you. Another student said, thank you for your extreme efforts to reach the non-nerds. You were very organized and I never worried that I would not have my questions answered. This was all very professional and respectful of all levels of previous knowledge. One other student said, I thoroughly enjoyed this class. There was a high level of information delivered by qualified instructors. I've absorbed an amazing amount of information, but the Doctors Dina delivered it in a very efficient and accessible way, so I never felt swamped. They willingly made themselves available for questions, and no question was too unimportant for them to answer. Thank you. Now, the reason that we answer everyone's questions that way is we always say if you have a question, it's likely that some other students do as well. And by you asking, that brings up a discussion and things get to sink in at a deeper level. We're offering it this way because many people have told us that when they take these so-called self-paced courses, they don't actually follow through. We refer to these self-paced courses as the abandonment model. They're just like, hey, you're on your own, no structure, no support, no anything. Other courses sometimes will offer a monthly interaction. Now, if you're watching something and you're getting some information and you have a question, you don't necessarily want to have to wait a whole month. Okay, that's just not so useful. But if you can wait less than a week, then you're covered. So we meet with you every week. We saw one course recently that you pay money and they give you a syllabus. In other words, go read this stuff and then you take a test and then you're certified. And the people get paid for offering you a syllabus and a test. Our program is very cohesive. You get all the pieces, and then you see how they all work together synergistically. Now, in a variety of other programs, you get exposed to the work of different educators, in some cases live, in other cases by video or by lessons that are pre-prepared. And on the one hand, it is useful to be exposed to different perspectives and different points of view. On the other hand, all the different people that you hear from have not gotten together to weave their points of view into a cohesive whole. Now, in our case, we expose you to lots of different sources of information, but because there's two of us, and because we're a married couple who are both really enthused about raw food nutrition, we're able to put everything into perspective, so you're left with how to integrate these different ideas for maximum benefit instead of being left confused. Now, we said that one student said that she appreciated that we catered to the non-nerds. I'll have to admit, though, we're nerds. We love this stuff. So when we're eating dinner, when we're driving down to buy produce or wherever else, driving up to teach our classes, when we're just chatting, when we're out taking a walk, when we're exercising, sometimes even when we're laying in bed, we'll come up with an idea. We talk about inflammation and blood vessels and B12 and lab tests and clinical stuff, and this is our idea of fun. Now, also, we are the only dual doctorate degree couple in the raw food community, and the synergy of that is really extraordinary. So we've got two well-researched, well-conceived, time-tested perspectives that work together synergistically. This extraordinary course is loaded with the most cutting-edge, unbiased, scientific, peer-based research, along with the essential fundamentals of nutrition. The instructors, Dr. Rick and Dr. Karen Dina, are brilliant, dedicated, and passionately driven to make a difference and transform people's lives. I have been an insulin-dependent diabetic for 20 years. I now feel enlightened and empowered with the knowledge from this class to live a life filled with health, vitality, and longevity. That was written by Barbara from Colorado. Another student said this was a comprehensive, well-presented course of study. I was delighted to see the depth of knowledge and the degree to which both Karen and Rick use peer-reviewed science to support the course material. I especially enjoyed the non-biased, informative approach. Thank you for sharing the depth and breadth of your knowledge with us. Now, when we taught our in-person Science of Raw Food Nutrition curriculum for the last 10 years, we got rave reviews, and so you just heard from a couple of them. But there was one central theme that we noticed. People loved the information, and the students wanted all of it, but a lot of them said, boy, it would really help if we could space this out over a longer period of time with more time to sink in so they could ask questions and get clear on this stuff themselves. So this is why we created this class in this format, the online plus interactive format. Now, when we were teaching in person, it was a different set of circumstances. People were away from home, and we wanted to make the best use of their time. Even considering that, the total cost was considerably more when taking travel, lodging, and time off work into account. With this new format, we don't have those constraints to worry about, and now we can offer you our new, revised, and updated curriculum in the manner that you have asked for. So what you get is 100 hours worth of very solid content, about 2 hours per week, as well as another roughly 50 hours worth of class discussion and question-answer sessions that you can attend live and get directly, get in direct communication with us, or if you miss one or so, you can access those once we've recorded them. Now keep in mind about this 100 hours, that 100 hours from us is probably more like 500 or so hours elsewhere. I purchased an online program a few years back about reading your own lab work, and this thing was 4 or 6 hours long, and as I went through that thing, oh God, I was just so frustrated. It took the guy so long to spell out what he could have said in about an hour without missing anything. Now, the thing is, we value your time as much as we value our own, and our commitment to you is to make the best use of that time. Have you ever seen a YouTube video where someone has a point that they can make in about 2 minutes, yet they just keep repeating themselves over and over and over again, and it takes them 20 minutes to get that out? That drives us nuts. Another example is we had a student who came to Living Light, where we used to teach our classes, to take the culinary courses, but they weren't interested in our nutrition curriculum because they had recently finished an extensive raw food nutrition course that she had paid multiple 5 figures for, like $30,000 to $40,000 for, and that was about 300 hours worth of content. So she figured, logically enough, hey, she knew it all. Why take this other nutrition course that's only 100 hours? But the registration staff encouraged her to take our first class, which was 12 hours, and see what she thought. At the lunch break on the first day, 3 hours in, she signed up for the rest of our series. We had another student who took that same extensive curriculum who in our first course said she learned more from the first 12 hours of our curriculum than she had in the over 2-month full-time course that she had taken previously. So here's a few more testimonials. I've gotten more from these 2 days than I got in a year at the, and she just didn't write the actual name, but well-known nutrition program, and I'm looking forward to the next segment. This next student said the sheer quantity and quality of information packed into 2 days by extremely knowledgeable and professional presenters was outstanding. Another student said if anyone's interested in learning more about science and nutrition, definitely attend these classes. Dr. Rick and Dr. Karen's delivery of information on topics I was a little scared of now became clear. But most of all, they made science fun. Brilliant. I will spread the word. Thank you so very much. And you are very welcome. It is our pleasure. As far as getting the most reliable, accurate, and useful information in the least amount of time, we have done that work for you. This information is not available anywhere else. You will get our decades of experience and literally tens of thousands of hours of our work, active work. I don't mean that we've been into raw food for tens of thousands of hours reading peer-reviewed literature, making sense out of things, putting classes together, etc., all distilled down into 100 hours. It would take you decades of research and education to get this level of understanding. We bring this information to you in bite-sized pieces over the course of 12 months with weekly support if you choose to take advantage of that. Our classes are based on peer-reviewed research with thousands of journal articles. Even in our book, the Raw Food Nutrition Handbook, there are several hundred references in there, and this curriculum is much more extensive than that. We also bring to the plate our personal experience of 25 to 30 years each, all our years of clinical experience, as well as our doctorate level educations presented in an easy to understand format. Gail from Massachusetts said, I really enjoyed the course and wouldn't know where I could find the wealth of material, breadth of information, and detailed and clear explanations anywhere else and as efficiently presented as Dr. Rick and Karen's excellent program. Thank you again. Another student said, Dr. Rick and Dr. Karen presented complex information in a clear and concise manner. It is a wonderful opportunity for those who do not have a background in biochemistry or nutrition. Highly recommended. This student said the discussion of insulin really helped me understand the chemical impact of food. I was very impressed with the ability to break down complex and technical information in terms that were understandable. Whether you're a well-read raw foodist or just starting the journey and researching, the information provided provides a great foundation for understanding the effect that food has on health and longevity. Another student said this was a great course that was well-researched and put together in a way that opened my eyes to the real facts about nutrition. And here's one more testimonial from a student who is near the end of her curriculum who was extra enthused, although this isn't too unusual. So she wrote, so far none of the Science of Raw Food Nutrition courses has failed to fascinate me. There are so many aspects to consider for each individual when designing a truly healthy diet and lifestyle that meets the needs of each person in an optimal way, and at first, it all sounds conflicting, confusing, and complicated. The more one studies the scientific facts and separates them from mere opinions, it all falls into place and makes perfect sense. Dr. Rick and Dr. Karen do a perfect job on guiding us on that path, and their combined knowledge and experience is phenomenal. These classes are a must for anyone wanting to learn about truly science-based facts and principles of healthy nutrition and lifestyle. Thank you so much for this class. Again, I learned so much and I am very glad I came again over from Japan to take this course. It greatly deepened my overall understanding of the science of raw food nutrition. And Beata came to take the level 1 and 2 class when we offered that, and then a few years later we offered our level 3 and advanced educator course, and she came back from Japan and was absolutely delighted. The way we're offering this now, you don't have to travel anywhere. Now, as far as the educator aspect of our curriculum is concerned, everyone ends up being an educator in one form or another when they eat a plant-based, vegan, or raw diet. You'll get questions, a whole bunch of them, okay, and we'll teach you how to answer those. Not just what to say, but how to say it to create rapport. This will allow you to feel more comfortable eating a raw food diet and help you be a positive influence on others, which may even allow you to gain some allies and some supporters. It's been known to happen. Additionally, when you have this solid foundation, you are much less likely to be led off track by people who are not well educated about nutrition. You won't be influenced by the people just spinning information out there who don't really know it so well, who have an agenda, who tell you that you're not going to get enough protein or calcium or iron or B12 or vitamin D or omega-3s and all that other stuff eating a raw food diet. You will not be knocked down. You'll be unknockable. Now, additionally, this course will provide the foundation or the prerequisite for our future coaching program where you can go out and coach and guide other people individually. So if you wait till next year, it'll actually be 2 years before you're finished with that education. Now, we heard some of the testimonials from our Science of Raw Food Nutrition students, and you will actually get a lot more time to ask us questions than our in-person classes, because again, we had to pack everything into a short amount of time to make good use of their time away from home. In your case, you get to ask us questions from the comfort of your own home. You won't have to pay for travel or lodging or take time away from your family or work. We know you have busy lives, and that's why we created the course in this manner. The structure of this course reflects the feedback that we've received from so many of you over the years, and we're just so happy to finally bring this to you in this form. This student said, "I like that I will now be able to express my lifestyle to worried friends." That's always nice. Another student says, "I liked the way difficult topics were explained in easy words so that it's easy to understand. I like the way this class covered topics that vegetarians are often asked, such as calcium, protein, etc. I hope one day you will teach worldwide, as I want my family, friends, and people who need your help to have a chance to attend your wonderful class." Thank you so much. And I love this quote because we now are teaching this class worldwide. You don't have to get on a plane or travel to a place far away from any major airport anymore. You can access us directly. This one says, "I recommend this course to anyone wanting to gain knowledge about the science of raw food. Doctors Rick and Karen really empowered me and gave me the confidence I needed to share this valuable information with my friends, family, and anyone that is curious. Thank you so much for an amazing course." Couple more here. "Take this class and your concerns about not getting enough nutrients, vitamins, protein, and minerals being vegan or raw vegan will disappear. It was well structured, very informative, and supported by data. And finally, this class really reinforced my motivation to be on and stay on a mostly raw diet, because now more than ever, I know why and how much my body benefits from it. Thank you so much, Drs. Rick and Karen Dina." And what we say to that is it is absolutely our pleasure.
Remember earlier when I told you my story about my decision to try raw food when I was in an energy pit of fatigue? Well, now it's time for you to make a decision. You are on this call because you are interested in raw food and in taking your knowledge to the next level so you can supercharge your health and maintain it for a lifetime. And at this point, you already know if you want to learn from us. This class will only be offered once this year. And once we fill our class, you will have to wait another year. and the price likely will go up next year. We're offering this course at a special introductory price that is lower than our combined in-person Science of Raw Food Nutrition and Educator curriculum. With this online format, however, you'll get much more time with us for questions and answers. You can access this course anywhere you have internet and phone access, which is most places on this planet. We'll be sending you an email shortly titled Let's Chat, and we invite you to respond to this email and book a time where you can talk to us, where we can answer your questions about this program. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great night. We look forward to talking to you soon.